Thanks so much, Duncan. It's always such a pleasure to hear Duncan, always so full of ideas and always put in a very, very fun kind of way. Grabs attention all the time. But I'm sorry I missed the talent show yesterday. It was a lot of fun, but next time I will surely be a part of it. As you may know, I've really been distracted, disoriented by developments in my own country. The saga continues. The vital vote on impeachment takes place at 5 p.m. Korea time, so 4 p.m. here. But I'm trying to push that all aside and concentrate on my discussion with you this morning. The topic of my conversation with Penny will be on the ever-present challenge in these days, which is the U.S. China competition and the emerging political risk that follow. Indeed, in the aftermath of the clear victory of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States, policymakers and thought leaders all around the world are talking about this, focusing their minds on this topic, and governments clearly are bracing themselves for what the second Trump presidency could mean for them and the world. And given what we know about President Trump from his first term, his promises on the campaign trail, and the changes in the geopolitical landscape during the past 4 years, I think a couple of things can be expected. These are nothing new. They've been said repeatedly in many fora by many speakers, but I'm just trying to collect them into some broad observations that I think apply in the months, years coming towards us. I think first, President Trump will drive his MAGA, the Make America Great Again agenda, with very little constraint this time. I think contrary to all expectations that the election would be neck and neck, the result of the U.S. presidential election was quite clear, giving Mr. Trump a robust mandate. Therefore, in his second term, President Trump will be much more emboldened, surrounded by loyalists who share his agenda, and unrestrained by professionals who can restrain his unconditional ways and excesses, as was often the case in the first term. Second, the United States will almost certainly do an about-face and pull out again from the Paris Agreement on climate change. This will be the biggest policy difference between the Biden administration and the second Trump term. And at a time when the world is getting tired of the so-called COP, the Conference of State Parties on Climate Change, which is the main global forum to rally efforts to cut emissions and make the grand transition to clean energy, the withdrawal of the United States from this forum could further demoralize climate action, or it could rally around other leaders, such as the EU and China, to continue the hard work. Third, Mr. Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy is likely to be revived, though how it is played out could be shaped by those around him. His appointments to key foreign policy positions are all hardliners, but they seem to vary from isolationists to primacist, hegemonists, to prioritizers. But in the end, my bet would be that where the transactional president wants a deal, they will oblige and help him to get the deal. Fourth, the second Trump presidency is unlikely to continue the concerted efforts of the Biden administration to rally security allies, with NATO in support of Ukraine in the war against Russia, or in the Indo-Pacific to counter an increasingly assertive China. Rather, Mr. Trump will deal with allies bilaterally and transactionally. For example, putting them to difficult negotiations over the cost of the alliance. This was a big issue for us during the first Trump presidency as we negotiated the cost-sharing agreement for the troop stations in South Korea. But this doesn't necessarily mean the bilateral alliances will be fundamentally weakened. The bipartisan support in Congress for these ties are strong. despite Mr. Trump's dismissive statements about them. And finally, the U.S. China relations are likely to worsen. The anti-China agenda in Washington started during the first Trump term over trade deficits and tech exports, further broadened and deepened during the Biden administration over geopolitical issues to become the overriding framework of the U.S. view of the world. During the campaign, Trump repeatedly threatened to impose a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports and a baseline of 10% or more on all imports. And by now, the mutual distrust between Washington and Beijing seems firmly entrenched and very hard to soften. So all in all, U.S.-China relations will be fraught in 2025. And already at their lowest point since 1979, diplomatic relations will grow increasingly volatile as the United States and China intensify strategic competition and focus on technological rivalry, trade tension, and security issues, especially in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. China can be expected to retaliate on the U.S. tariffs and push back on U.S. policies, especially regarding Taiwan. Beijing will be watching very closely for any signs from Washington that indicates the slightest shift in the one China policy. For Southeast Asia, on the economic side, the U.S.-China competition is uncomfortable, but an opportunity. The decoupling, de-risking, China-one strategies of major companies are benefiting the economies of the region as they are hedging against China and setting up operations, and record levels of foreign direct investments are flowing into the region. On the geopolitical side, the tension could escalate between China and the littoral countries in Southeast China Sea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and this will continue to be a potential flashpoint to be carefully managed. And overall, unless the second Trump presidency makes a concerted effort, which frankly seems unlikely, the United States' influence and standing in the region will continue to decline as that of China continues to rise. And one final point to add, in Northeast Asia, the newly established military alliance between North Korea and Russia has complicated the strategic outlook of the surrounding powers. For China, the leverage it has had on Russia as well as on North Korea has weakened, as Russia and North Korea now have each other for support. For the United States, North Korea is emboldened and no longer alone in guarding and advancing its nuclear and missiles capabilities. For South Korea, North Korea's all-out campaign to paint the South as an eternal enemy to guard against preempts any space it could have in future engagements with North Korea, as is very likely in the second Trump presidency. The wild card will be Russia, as it contemplates making the most of the security pact with North Korea to advance its strategic interest in the region. So these are just some of my observations as we prepare for the second Trump presidency. And of course, I am intensely watching the developments in my own country as well in the aftermath of the short-lived martial law, and I'm happy to answer any questions in this regard as well. Thank you very much.
Testing. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Kang. This is one session that I think many of our fellows, alumni, and new have been looking forward to. And there's been a lot of talks at coffee tables, but also in social media, traditional news media, but it's never the same hearing from yourself, who has got great insight and first-hand experience and knowledge of the issues on U.S. China competition. And of course, we hope we would also hear from you a little bit about the situation in South Korea in the later part of the discussion. So once again, thank you for your insight. It looks like we are in what Duncan has described as being in a VUCA world. And the election or the re-election of President-elect Trump, I think, adds to the uncertainty itself. And we're also seeing, as you have said, a lot of appointments that suggest perhaps, a harder line coming up in negotiations and foreign policies. So given all of this, I know you have spoken about the projection of what it might look like going forward. And if you are the advisor to Southeast Asia, briefing a group of leaders, what would be some of the strategies that you would suggest for Southeast Asia in particular, since we're in Singapore, to take on? And also, if you are, if you have a chance to brief China and U.S., what would your advice be to them?
Well, I think Southeast Asia. This is. Okay. I have to expect the leaders of the countries already having spelled out a strategy on how to deal with the second Trump presidency. This is the job of governments, preparing for contingency. So I would expect all of the countries to have one already in place. But for Southeast Asia, I think the centrality and the solidarity of ASEAN is a big plus. I would think that you would want to utilize that and maximize it to your not just to the Asian as a group, but the member states. There is a great deal of difference among the 10 ASEAN countries, economic differences, political differences, and historical, diplomatic. But perhaps this is a time, the challenge of Mr. Trump, an opportunity to really rally behind the ASEAN as one identity. I think the economic opportunities are quite good in the midst of the decoupling and de-risking between the United States and China. I think the one scenario for that relationship between the two powers would be complete decoupling if some of the isolationists in the Trump campaign would have their way. And that means much of what was happening between the US and China will be coming the way of Southeast Asia. India is already experiencing a great deal of that fallout, so is Vietnam, Indonesia. And so this is already happening, but to manage this in a way that benefits your economies, but also doesn't get in the crosshair of US sanctions and trade restrictions. There's already talk about how China is circumventing the tariffs by moving operations to other countries such as Mexico, and probably they'll be looking at Southeast Asia. So I think there has to be a political agility in dealing with what headwinds could be coming your way from the new administration as it expands and deepens its reach to see where China's influence continues to penetrate. So maximize the economic benefits, but be ready politically to engage with the US new authorities on the front. China, I think I would urge both sides to keep up the communication channels that started after the Biden-Xi summit, last year. Frankly, I don't expect it. I think the channels of communication will greatly dwindle under the second Trump administration. But it would be wise for the two sides to keep them open. The Jake Sullivan Wang Yi channel was hugely beneficial in keeping things stable between the two sides. And other countries would want to see something like that continue under the second Trump presidency. And ultimately, Mr. Trump and President Xi establishing a working relationship that is frequent and extensive. I think, given Mr. Trump's and also President Xi's, it's only at that summit level, the top level, that significant changes can be made. So this would be the advice I would give on both sides.
How likely is that to happen?
As I said already. But
I mean, what are the chances of Xi and Trump seeing eye to eye?
Well, they don't. I don't think that we can expect them to see eye to eye. There's already a great deal of mistrust. Whatever the other side does is automatically seen as something that is motivated to harm your side, which is
it's
also
a zero-sum game.
It's seen as a zero-sum game, and we do know that trade is not a zero-sum game.
Of course it isn't.
So that message has constantly to be delivered, but even if you don't see eye to eye, you should never break up communication. If you see eye to eye, you don't need to communicate, do you? It's because you don't see eye to eye that you need to keep up that level of commitment, and the higher it goes, the better.
Right. So, some time ago, well, just maybe about a month or two ago, I was talking to someone in the technology sector. He owns a big semiconductor firm, and he was expressing, how frustrated he is, because what he really wanted to do, so he's a bit of a nerdy CEO, a person who is, obsessed with coming out with the best, the bigger, better, cheaper, kind of technology so that the masses can enjoy. However, he said he's caught in this U.S. China competition and is restricting the way that he could produce and, of course, sell, right? So he's forced into this, and his expression to me was, this is not just about me wanting to create the things for the masses, it's also about the hundreds, in fact thousands of consumers, or rather hundreds of employees, staff that he has, right, whose livelihood is at stake, and the millions of people who could have benefited from this technology itself. But he's frustrated because he's not able to produce as much as he could have, just because of all the tariffs, all the restrictions, and the two countries wanting him on their side. And it gives me some thoughts about, well, what is this? What does this whole rivalry really means to the man on the street? On an upper level, we talk about the policy matters, but on the daily level, to the layman, right, it means perhaps delayed technology adoption and therefore falling behind, or it means a much higher price, so affordability issues. So the idea of democratizing technology and therefore uplifting those from rural villages and so on will become a much bigger challenge than what we already see. So the question is, how do we go about encouraging, first of all, the policy makers to take perhaps a stronger, more proactive stand to encourage a higher level of collaboration and understanding? What can political leaders do within the countries to ensure that the democratization of technology still happens, at least within their countries. And how do we then also activate, for example, this class to do a little bit more in bringing those benefits, technology benefits, even with the U.S. China competition, to their own region? I know it's a very tough question.
But
you know.
I think we have to face the reality. This is no longer the era of open globalization, where efficiency, real-time delivery, transparency, sharing, this is no longer the reality of geopolitics. Technology has become the front line, the frontier of geopolitical competition. That's just the fact. That's the reality. But given that reality, I think governments, as governments are currently, I mean, China is what, 40% of the new intellectual property registration being made in WIPO, for example, right? So countries are encouraging young minds to be innovative with lots of research and development support, and that certainly should continue, and I think young leaders should encourage their governments to put a lot of their resources into this area. One of the things that the young generation in my country was frustrated with this government was that you just out of the blue cut R&D budgets from the science ministry just overnight. So so you can. There are things that you can do internally to keep the innovation and new technology development going. But I think as business owners, having to be really sensitive and updated about the policies that are being designed in Washington and DC, and what you might run into as you try to develop. I mean, for all good intentions to develop this and make it a good for the whole of humanity, the idea is wonderful, but you are going to run into blockades because technology inherently, in many cases, dual purpose. And this is where expert controls come in. Dual purpose in the sense that it's good, it goes into commercial products, but also chips, for example. They all go into military products. And all countries have export control regimes. And the regimes are getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And so you have to be constantly aware of where the security mindset is framing the tech side of things. I mean, the big discussion is now on AI. It's a good thing that China and the United States are talking about AI. They have jointly introduced a resolution on AI at the United Nations, for example. So that's good. But my sense that they're not really talking at the core issues. They're just skirting around it and just pronouncing broad principles of how AI has to be human-centered, automatic weapons in the defense use of AI has to have a human agency in the chain somewhere. So it's all nice, but so far no concrete regulations agreed to that would bring the benefits of AI, but also rein in the negative, potentially negative consequences of AI. And it's just up to the individual entrepreneur to keep abreast of the developing field of AI and other technology regulations and see what issues are being prominently discussed and fought over in the U.S. China, but also other, the EU is a big player. Korea has also a big stake in the tech field, as Japan. India is also big in the IT service field. So yes, not easy being a tech entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, but technology is not just restricted to AI, right? I think you're very right, that actually AI in itself, especially generative AI, is a very new field. And it's not just the policy makers are struggling to get a hold of it or make sense of it. The entrepreneurs and even those people who are writing the codes, who are, should I say, inventing, the generative AI themselves, are also struggling with how to make real good sense of it. I think we saw the exodus of some top engineers from OpenAI, and we're continuing to see a lot of all these movements in all the big IT companies. So in a sense, anything to do with AI, generative AI, I think will be a bit of, in Singapore we use a term, tarik, which means a bit of letting it loose, reining it back, letting it loose, reining it back, to make sense of it. So I would think that, for AI-related technology, it will be like that for quite a while policy makers try to catch up with it, make sense, and come to some very core agreements. But like I said, AI is not the only technology competition between the two countries. Are there others that we should be aware of? So we know AI, we know semiconductor. Those are the well-known ones.
My reading of the history of technological development is that human knowledge and wisdom to fully utilize for the benefit of mankind always lags behind. This is what is called the cultural lag. So for example, when internet was invented by the U.S. military, nobody knew that it would grow to be the air that we breathe today. Nobody knew when wireless communication was invented by Mr. Bell that this is the start of the waves in the air that connects the whole world with all kinds of media. Nobody knew, so it's always, I think, and this is my fear, technology runs ahead of human knowledge and wisdom to make the best of it. And in the case of AI, it is so vast, so much potential, and certainly there is a lot of good to be gained from it. Thomas Friedman has a nice piece recently on how the U.S. and China, forget about the competition on trade. You need to work together on AI because 4 years later, we're going to be faced with not just AI and generative AI, but super AI. That I think was a big warning, but it also reaffirms my amateurish understanding about these implications. But there are other technologies, for example, genetic engineering, which is also could be creating human beings in labs. Quantum computing, which I don't quite have an understanding what that is, but I also understand that it's a very disruptive technology. So there's many areas, yeah.
Right. And there's also the fight for minerals, for natural resources.
Yes, the fight for natural resources, at least it's more concrete, right? we know.
Because we understand it better.
We understand it better, we know where they are, we know who has what, and where there's who holds the leverage and where explorations are being conducted. And yes, this is where also the trade war will be fought, because this is one area where I think China has a huge advantage. Yes.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned this thing about, how AI is going to change the facade of many things. I read an article recently about what NVIDIA said, that in time to come, and I think it's a much shorter time than we anticipate, they will not be looking at just, a chief of staff for human workers, but they are looking to build a company with some, I think it was 50,000 real human workers and 100 million AI workers, robot workers. And they predict that, that will probably be the way things are going to be with a high-tech company in time to come. So
I'm a huge belief in the enormous potential of the human brain.
Of course.
I think, normally we use only a small part of our brain. And as robots and AI take over what we usually do with our brains, I think we human beings will start using other parts of the brains that we have not been using. And this is proven by people who are suddenly impaired. For example, you lose your eyesight. And over time, you discover that the neurons that supported your eyesight have gently transitioned to supporting your ear side, for example, which is why visually impaired people are very good at hearing. So the human brain is quite flexible and adaptable and expandable. And I think, yes, AI will and robots will take over a lot of the things that we do, but I think the things that human beings do in the future will also be expanding into new areas that we've never thought of before.
Indeed. As you say that, actually we have one of our new fellows who is hearing impaired. He's right over there, seated right over there. Say hello, right? And if you see him, looking at his phone all the time, then that's because, he's actually getting all the information and messages from the phone
visual
itself.
Yes.
But I've noticed that he's very good with his eyes.
Yeah.
So he tries to lip read and, look at what's going on. So his sense, right, of sight and sense of, what's going on in a room could be actually much sharper than most of us who are using all five senses.
I hope I did, yes.
It actually helped me because I have a hearing loss.
Yes.
So with kind of that you don't understand everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that way it has been very beneficial for me.
Great. Yeah. So one clear benefits of technology. Yes.
That's right. So, coming back into this issue about the trade war itself, do you think that, as each country tried to figure, what the new policies of U.S. might be in terms of trade, in terms of foreign policy and all, do you think that, we are actually heading towards the new Cold War?
That's a loaded word, and it brings up that image of the West, East, the Soviet bloc versus the Western bloc. This is not that. The world is too interconnected, too interdependent to be cut into blocks like that. So even as China, even if U.S. completely decouples from China economically, China is intricately linked to other parts of the world. And that other part of the world also is intricately linked to the United States. So the interdependencies, I think, will certainly continue and deepen. So I don't know what to call it, but certainly there is the geopolitical competition that is no longer appropriate to call this era of globalization. I don't know, I don't have a term, but I wouldn't call it Cold War.
I hope it won't get to that either. Mm-hmm. But then, there is a lot of pressure, even in, Ambassador Ashok's speech last night, that even ASEAN itself is facing a pressure to, I wouldn't want to use the word take sides, but to align them where, the national interest brings them.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can also be somewhat iffy, to put it most lightly, right?
Well, as I said, I think ASEAN is in a good position not to take sides. A country like South Korea has it much harder because we are security-wise very dependent on the alliance relationship we have with the United States. Economic-wise, very dependent on our trade and investments relations with China. So the idea of not choosing is much more difficult for us than for ASEAN, which is, it varies with different countries among the 10, but overall, ASEAN has made it clear that we don't want to choose. We want the best of our relations with the United States as well as China. And I think that's, and India, of course. India is very happily multi-aligned And that's why India is also courted.
That's right.
So the more you stick your ground, the more you emphasize your own agency. And of course, you can emphasize your own agency if you have that ability, if you have that agencies. And countries have agencies. I mean, even South Korea has agency that it can use vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis China. And I think we should also be careful of being swept up by the messaging coming out from China or the United States. For example, the United States says Russia, China, North Korea, Syria are now one bloc, an axis of resistance and blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you look at the foreign policies of the four countries, they're very different. You cannot lump them together as one bloc against the West. Especially, as I said, with Russia and North Korea having drawn very close together in the midst of the Ukraine war, and China's view of this. China also, just to lump China and Iran together as an anti-US, is also a very naive and simplistic reading of the relationship. So I think not to get swept up by that just sweeping narrative about how these countries, that requires really keen observation and looking at the messages that come out from the countries themselves and not getting completely directed by what's coming out from the Western media. I think the Western media is already very much in one direction, and it's very difficult to see the facts and the objective facts in the midst of the Western media's interpretation of what's going on in this geopolitical game.
Well, you're absolutely right, but I think, to add to the complexity of the media news, there's also the social media.
Yes.
And now, AI-generated fake news, right, that looks so real that you can't, for many laymen, it's very hard for them to distinguish between what is real, what is fact, and what's fiction. And I think, this is a struggle for many countries. The news that is coming out from the West goes in one direction. The news that's coming up from China a lot of the time also goes in a particular direction. So it makes it actually very difficult for both laymen and sometimes even, at a top leadership level, not to be swept away by some of the emotions attached to, these videos and some of the facts attached to these videos. In the case of Singapore, to share, we are a small country, we are in ASEAN, we would love to, reap some of the dividends from some of the U.S. China competition, right? To safeguard our own interests, because being a very, very small country, it's very easy for people to come exert some pressure. So for many years, more than 10 years, we've been trying to build our neutrality, trying to be the Switzerland of, Asia itself. So we brought, the International Arbitration Court, into Singapore. We positioned ourselves as a place for negotiation. So we held the Ma Ying-jeou dialogue in Singapore. We held the Trump, Kim, North Korea Kim's dialogue in Singapore, and so on and so forth. And also we invited many MNCs, into Singapore, so that the interests of different countries and different powers are entrenched in this land itself. But despite that, we do get a lot of pressure from time to time, from different sides. So it's to what your point earlier on, it is going to be very difficult to actually not take sides, but yet we have to try our very best to maintain that neutrality, and perhaps, like you said again, that ASEAN, it would be a very, very good ground if all the political leaders could also align themselves to being neutral at all times, in fact. I would like to, open the floor to our fellows Well, I've not finished, and I see 10 hands coming up. So, so I would like to, lay down some house rules first. The first is, when you're called upon, please state your name, where you're from, which year, and then, go straight into the questions, because we have many, waiting to ask questions. So no statements, just questions. And can we take 3 questions at a time? Right? And if you have any questions about the situation in South Korea, we'll leave that, to the later part. Okay? So let's focus on the U.S. China competition. Okay? I see a hand over there, so maybe I'll take from this side of the room first, and then this side later. So 1, 2, 3. Okay? All right? Do we have a microphone there?
Yep, good morning. I'm Adeline from Taipei, Taiwan. First of all, thank you so much for Dr. Kang, your very insightful presentation. So just as you mentioned, like Taiwan has always been one of the hottest topics in China and U.S. relations. And apparently Xi Jinping has declared that Taiwan as a red line, urging the United States not to support Taiwan self-defense, sovereignty, not to mention Taiwan independence. And my question is, in your opinion, that under Trump next second presidency, will Taiwan issues remain, equally important to the United States, or due to Trump's transactional approach to politics, Taiwan may become bargaining chips in U.S. and Taiwan relations? And if that is the case, what's your advice to the countries in the region to take action to prevent another conflict in the Taiwan Strait? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, good morning. My name is Amy. I'm from Brunei. I specifically wanted to ask about how globalization has really evolved over the years, and whether you see this as a move towards regionalization, back towards regionalization, and specifically around the example of ASEAN, which I love that you mentioned that, where we are seeing now more regional trade agreements, and perhaps political alignment may not be possible, but because of our commercial and trade lanes, especially with DEFA, do you feel that could bolster sort of a regional strengthening of an identity that can withstand the pull of choosing either side?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kang. I'm Josh from Singapore. So one question I have is, you mentioned about ASEAN centrality. How would you say that ASEAN countries can best maintain the centrality while there are jurisdictions pulling and picking at the various ASEAN countries bilaterally? And second, regarding tech. Tech is the front line of geopolitical confrontation. I work on tech regulations. At the same time, to maximize innovation and risks, as you mentioned, there's a need for interoperability, harmonization, and convergence. How is this going to play out, especially when you need to balance national interest versus global or regional interests? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. No problem. all very difficult issues. Obviously, on the tech front, as I said, this is the front line of geopolitical competition. Interoperability, all of that, I don't think I have the technological depth to say anything of significance there, but countries at the end are driven by national interest. Regional solidarity, trade agreements, bilateral, regional, global. Countries enter into those agreements because it serves their national interest. Visionary leaders will go for these for the longer term national interest. Short-sighted national leaders will look for the short-term gains. But for example, my country, because we had leaders who saw the long-term benefits of free trade agreements, we went after them like crazy. And as a result, we have the economy that we have. I think Singapore also. So it's in the end driven by national interest. So if you have leaders who see the long-term interest of the continued global engagement, we will move in that direction. If you have national leaders who are more for the short term and to get headlines, that's what you'll get. And I think therefore it is up to concerned, thoughtful leaders, citizenry such as yourself, who have your constituency, you have your community, to have an idea in your own head about what your national interest is and how you establish that in these changing global landscape. But I mean that applies to technology and all other hot button items on the global stage. ASEAN, yes, centrality much more a rhetoric than substantial at this point, but don't underestimate the achievements of ASEAN so far over the past 6 decades. It's an extraordinary achievement for 10 countries of the region who have fought each other, who have undergone ethnic strife, to be together at this stage and trying very hard to work together. From the Northeast Asian perspective, this is a point of huge envy, right? I remember when President Moon was hosting the 10 ASEAN leaders in Busan, and we took them to see a smart city showcase piece where everything was green, everything was blah blah. And we had the prime ministers of, I think, Thailand, Laos, and Deputy Prime Minister Cambodia. And they were talking, we couldn't even know which language they were talking, but they were going around this exhibition hall like three brothers at out on a picnic. And my president, I remember saying, how wonderful it would be to have neighbors like that you could just casually, I mean, you can differ, you can fight, but to be able to casually converse like that. So I would not underestimate that togetherness that ASEAN has developed over the 6 decades. Work in progress, but certainly something to guard and strengthen. Myanmar is a big sore in this mix, and that's ASEAN's approach to this has not been effective so far. And I have no answer to how this simmering conflict could be resolved, but at some point it will. And I think Asia needs to find a strategic way of dealing with the Myanmar situation and bring it back into the fold. Mr. Xi's Taiwan has always been not just Mr. Xi's, but China's red line. Mr. Trump, it could be, very transactional, could be very dismissive. But the hawks around him in the first term were very protective of Taiwan. So it will be an interplay between his tendency to be transactional and his advisors, clearly, desire to be more forceful and protective of Taiwan. There is the potential of a clash along the strait if I think the Trump new administration does something that China sees as being furthering the idea, further weakening the idea of the one China policy. There could be it's being managed now, but it could develop into a military conflict. But even in that case, I think it would be terrible if it then, went out of control and developed into a major conflict between the two powers, two nuclear powers. So there should be contingency planning on both sides to contain any conflict, any flare-up that might take across the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, I think as in our conversation yesterday, both countries would probably prefer not to go to war on that.
Yeah.
But I think what we do fear is an incident or an accident
Yeah.
on the streets itself. Maybe we can take some more questions. So I'll take from this side now. So I saw your hand much earlier on, so that's for you. And then I'll take from this side. All right, gentlemen, and this lady. So we have yourself. Sorry, I don't know your name yet. So let us know your name, which class you're from, which country you're from, and straight to the question. So 1, 2, the gentleman, and 3. Right.
My name is Devjot Ghoshal. I'm the class of 2024. I'm from India, but I'm based in Bangkok. I have 2 questions for you, Dr. Kang. I think the first is, we've spoken a lot about how, that you changed within the sort of U.S. leadership, but what I'm interested to understand is your perspective on what's changed within the Chinese leadership in the time between the first Trump administration and the new one. President Xi has consolidated power. We've seen ministers disappear. So I'm interested in your perspective on sort of how the Chinese leadership itself has changed. And the second question is the role of the Quad in Asia Pacific. How do you see the Quad playing out under a second Trump presidency? Thank you.
Okay. Second question.
Hi.
Keep it short, yeah?
Hunter McDonald, class of 2024, from U.S., based in Japan. I'd like to hear your perspective on, after change in the executive branch in Japan, Korea, and U.S., how do you evaluate the potential trajectory of the trilateral partnership that was announced at Camp David under the Biden administration, and how do you see that going forward vis-a-vis U.S. China geopolitical rivalry?
Thank you.
Dr. Kang, thank you very much. I'm Elizabeth Jiang, and I'm the class of 2024. So my question is, as the world is polarizing and there are so many conflicts and challenges, what is your call to action for our, fellows, members of the Asia 21 Summit? What can we do to contribute? And also, as Duncan has mentioned, within challenges, there are also opportunities. So how can we best harness the opportunities that arise in these situations? Thank you.
Okay, certainly, President Xi started in 2012, right? So he was there during the first presidency of Trump, and now he's there ready to welcome Mr. Trump back as his counterpart. As you say, in the meanwhile, he's consolidated his one-person leadership, which is very different from the collective leadership of past Chinese governments. We see increasingly, there's, from time to time, the balance shifts to more economic growth and prosperity side. But here, clearly, he's a leader who is very much prioritizing security. And that, I think, if you see his leadership through that prism, it explains his policies during the COVID times. It explains his policies on reining in the corporate leaders who got too big, reining in private enterprise, and that has led to the economic slump. So the government is trying to, bring back some life into the economy with measures. But at a fundamental level, it is security that drives Mr. And increasingly, that will be increasingly the case, which then the U.S. anti-rhetoric very much feeds into that mindset of guarding national security vis-a-vis this increasingly hawkish the U.S. administration, which is why I think in 2025 we expect to see that relationship becoming further fraught and difficult. But all the more the reason for diplomacy, active diplomacy, to kick in. Quad, Mr. Trump doesn't like regional multilateral settings. He likes to deal with countries individually. But Quad was something that was created during his first presidency. So he may have a particular affection for that. But because of India's position on Russia, war in Ukraine, the solidarity of Quad as a security cooperative forum has been greatly weakened, in my perspective. So will it come back as a security? I don't think it will ever become an alliance as such, but a cooperative forum where the four countries work together to deal with the security challenges of the world. I don't think Mr. Trump will put his efforts in that direction, not himself. The U.S. China trilateral cooperation. This trilateral cooperation was possible not because the U.S. pulled Korea and Japan together, but Korea under Mr. Yoon decided to forget the past, work with Japan, and take the bilateral relationship to another level. So that was what made possible then Washington to come in and create this trilateral consensus, the Washington Consensus. So now with Mr. Yoon seems to be on his way out, it'll be that bilateral tie, the future of that bilateral tie is now questioned. Call for action. Oh, goodness. I mean, it's a fraught world, right? But I think you are all young leaders with influence, power to make things happen, to change people's minds, and to make demands on your national leaderships. So I would certainly urge you to use that power to steer the policy thinking, whether it's in government, whether it's in parliament, so that these difficult geopolitical issues are managed and not left to get out of hand. They have to be managed, and this requires diplomacy. I have to admire the diplomats that Singapore raises. They're top class. And if Singapore can raise these diplomats, other countries can do. And so I hope, I don't know how many of you are from the diplomatic profession, but you don't have to be in formal diplomacy to play that role. So make sure that you are capable, you as an individual is a capable, able influencer, and then try to share that power with the others around you in a way, as I always say, every morning you wake up and wanting to do good for the world. That seems like a very stale thing to say, but to this day, this is what I tell myself, and I think you should also.
It's a very good mantra to adopt.
Yes.
You mentioned, Mr. Yoon, and I think the happenings in South Korea has been keeping you very, very busy. We did promise, our fellows that, you will give your sense of what's going on. In the first place, the declaration of martial law took many by surprise and sent shockwaves, not just around the Korean Peninsula, but, even beyond. So can you share with us, so what were some of the key events and motivations that led to this declaration of martial law, and how has this, well, I don't think it's impacted the lives of Koreans, South Koreans too much, because it did not really, kicked in. But, what then, going forward from there are some of the factors that will determine the future of South Korea's political landscape in the wake of this declaration.
Well, I have to say, as I always do in the morning, I turn on my YouTube and watch Korean live television news. At Friday morning around 9, just before 9, I turned it and I saw the president declaring martial law, and I said, this is AI generated fake news.
That's right, I checked that twice too.
So then I went to work, and it turns out to be true. It was completely out of the blue. So it was a stunning development, not just for the world, but for Koreans in the country. It just really came out of the blue. Thankfully, 2 hours and 30 minutes later, the National Assembly met and resolved to demand a lifting of the martial law. And thankfully, the president ceded. So this happened. It really turned out to be just an overnight happening. But then the aftermath is a very complicated political process. The opposition has tabled an impeachment motion that will be voted this afternoon at 5 p.m., 4 p.m. here, so watch out for flashing news. What drove the president to make this announcement? There's some clear indications in his statement when he declared this, that he is doing this because the National Assembly is completely dysfunctional, completely in the hands of the opposition party that won't let him do anything that he wants to do, and it's in the hands of, he says, dark forces and as communist sympathizers, anti-state forces that want to undermine our liberal, free, democratic republic. And I think that was a clear indication of how he had surrounded himself with advisors, key advisors, that very much reinforced his very prejudiced, contorted view of the world. And the news that are coming out after the failed martial law and how things were prepared before he declared clearly indicated he really himself believed that there were dark forces that had rigged election results, that were passing, that were not enabling him to put key people to positions of power. So, for example, he sent special forces to the National Election Commission, as he also sent people to the special forces, fully armed, mind you, special forces to the National Assembly to prevent the National Assembly from meeting. The National Assembly Commission, a non-political, non-partisan party that only oversees election, this was because he had been stuck on this idea that past elections that gave the opposition party the win were somehow rigged inside the system, right? So he clearly feels and is but I think this is so revealing of the echo chambers that it's so easy to fall into in these days of social media. Everyday people, and even leaders at the highest level. The danger of a leader who is caught up in his warped view of the world and surrounded by sycophants who will only reinforce that worldview is the only way I can explain why he has decided to do this. Of course, on the other side, there were all kinds of political challenges relating to corruption charges against his wife, his lack of forceful dealing with mishaps that happened since his took power. So, yes, these are real issues, but I think he felt he could override all the problems that have been laid at its foot with this grand scenario about how the country itself was facing a fundamental challenge from these dark forces. And that was just so surreal, frankly, for everyday people on the streets and those who are looking at it from the far side. Even as he withdrew the declaration, it was the same. I am doing this only to save my country. And he has continued to stick to the line. He was supposed to deliver a statement at 10 a.m. this morning. I don't know if he did it. It will be interesting to see if he has ceded now or is sticking to his sense of heroism that I am only doing this for the good of the country. Just underscoring the dangers that lie with this very convoluted information environment where it's so easy to fall into your own echo chamber, right?
I know that there are many questions in your room, but then I've also been given the indication that, you know, we are already on the stretch. So I want to thank Dr. Kang, but we still have a little bit of time.
Could I just also add on this side? It's so ironic that as the president was plotting this, something that was possible, even thinkable 40, 50 years before, right? On the other hand, we now have a South Korean author being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel Literature Prize, for her description of the historic traumas that the country has faced, including the Gwangju massacre of 1980 under military rule. And so I feel like this is where the country is. This is where the young generation, the national character, the spirit is, she represents that. And he is a throwback to an old time where men in arms thought they could get their way with might.
Do we have time for any questions? Okay. Okay, the great Sanjeev, you know. No, that's fine, you know, but I think it was a very, I would say, enlightening conversation that we have, you know, with the class here. It is clear that we do live in very confusing times. We're confused by the news that's coming out from traditional media because they tend to be now very one-sided or politically motivated. At the same time, you know, the social media has all kinds of echo chambers that's embedded in there as well to either, you know, help us form a particular opinion or, you know, persuade us in another direction. And I think it is also amidst this time itself that some of us can, you know, become pretty pessimistic and even lose hope. And I know that a lot of people especially young people in certain countries are now having this phenomena called tangping, and that means, you know, just do nothing. Especially if AI can do the work, right? But then there are also a lot of, I would say, you know, good-blooded young people, as well as forever young people, you know, yeah, who will always, you know, maintain that sense of hope and the possibility of doing something. And I think that's represented by the people in this room. But more importantly, and I think it's the fact that amidst all of this time, we are going to be confused from time to time. We're going to lose hope from time to time, but we will also find a lot of opportunities. And that's the history of human survival and, you know, our civilizations. The path forward demands absolutely a calm heart, an inner peace, clear-headed analysis, and I would say mindful leadership. It is for this reason that tomorrow we will also have a special session on mindfulness in the morning, so that, you know, our fellows, as you navigate some of these global complexities, I urge you to come to the session to learn some techniques in mindful leadership and of course, you know, bringing yourself and decentralize yourself. But also I urge you, you know, to adopt what Dr. Kang has said, that you need to, you know, be aware, be awakened to the facts and become a responsible actor, shaping a more secure and stable future. Because like it or not, you know, there is no winner in rivalries, and we are one humanity. So on that note itself, you know, let us learn a lot more from Dr. Kang, her calmness and absolute poise amidst all this flurry that's going on in the background, right? Phew, that's right. And of course, for her generosity in enlightening us with her deep insight. I have learned a lot from you, and I look forward to more conversations. And I would invite all the fellows, all our team members, to give Dr. Kang a very warm round